An ecosystem is defined as a community. If you remember, a community is all the organisms in a given area, and the abiotic factors, water, soil, climate, that affect them. The number of organisms in an ecosystem fluctuates over time as a result of mechanisms such as migration, birth, death, things like that. These fluctuations are essential for ecosystem stability and characterize the dynamic nature of ecosystems. If you remember back from cell transport, we don't reach a true balance. In diffusion, things like that, you reach a dynamic equilibrium, and living systems do that too, but on a much larger scale. Extreme fluctuations in the size of a population offset the stability of ecosystems in terms of habitat and resource availability. So a stable ecosystem is going to be fairly predictable. The population, the supply, the energy is going to be fairly constant and therefore stable. When we remember energy and matter, we must remember the common theme we've looked at since the beginning of the year. Energy flows and matter cycles. All living systems need matter and energy, and as energy and matter go through an ecosystem, matter must be recycled and reused. The cycling of matter and the flow of energy within ecosystems occur through interactions among different organisms and between organisms and their physical environment. And matter fuels the energy-releasing chemical reactions that provide the energy for life to function. In the most basic biogeochemical cycle, we'll have producers, consumers, and geological processes going back and forth. What we see is that ultimately everything connects back to a decomposer, and decomposition connects all of the trophic levels, all the levels of life together into one giant network. The water cycle is the most straightforward of these cycles, and you've looked at it a little bit since elementary school. The major reservoirs are things like the ocean, groundwater, lakes, rivers, streams, creeks, wetlands, what have you, and the water vapor in the air. Now, where does that water go? Well, it evaporates from the exposed surface water, and it transpirates from the groundwater through plants. Transpiration is one of the big problems for human effects, because if you cut down the trees, well, groundwater is not going to be transpired to the atmosphere. You're not going to generate rain. So say the Amazon rainforest, you cut down enough trees, what do you have? You don't have a rainforest anymore. You have a desert. So without things like transpiration, precipitation can fail. So the water cycle is ultimately powered by solar energy, but without trees, it will fail. The carbon cycle depends mainly on photosynthesis and cell respiration for the living components, and you have some chemistry stuff going on in the aquatic systems. The carbon cycle provides an example of the cycling of matter and the flow of energy. Photosynthesis, the digestion of plant matter, respiration, and decomposition are important components that you should be sure to understand. That gas, that carbon dioxide, will be stored in living things and in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis will use CO2, respiration will release CO2 and connect all of life. Main reservoir will be the CO2 in the atmosphere and the CO2 held within living things. Humans, through burning of fossil fuels, are releasing way more CO2 into the atmosphere than is sustainable, and that has led to what we call global warming. Looking at the nitrogen cycle, we need to look at a couple things different than some of the other systems. The main reservoir for nitrogen is the atmosphere. Most of the gas that you are breathing right now is nitrogen. But animals and plants, they have no way of turning that gaseous atmospheric nitrogen into usable nitrogen. So what we have to depend upon is bacteria that fix the nitrogen and turn it into something that plants and animals can use, namely eat. These bacteria will be in plant roots and in the soil and will help us turn nitrogen into useful stuff. Once that's been created, the organism being eaten, dying, excreting feces, or whatever, will return nitrogen back to the soil, where other bacteria, decomposing bacteria and ammonifying bacteria and so on, will turn that nitrogen back into other substances and ultimately back through denitrifying bacteria into atmospheric nitrogen. Humans are releasing a lot of nitrogen into the system through fertilizers, which leads to overproduction of things like algae, which can be a big problem for aquatic systems. Homeostasis in an ecosystem is a steady state or dynamic equilibrium in which conditions are held more or less constant despite changes in biotic or abiotic environmental factors. Ecosystems are dynamic in nature. Their characteristics fluctuate over time, and depending on changes in the environment and the population of various species, your ecosystem can be very different. And what we see is that really complex interactions within an ecosystem can keep its numbers and types of organisms relatively constant. But if you have a major shift, then your ecosystem will no longer be stable. Basically, there is a tipping point, and once you go beyond that tipping point where ecosystems are not okay, it can be almost irrecoverable. If you looked at the last diagram on the homeostasis slide, you see something called ecological succession. Ecological succession is the sequence of changes in an ecosystem that regenerate a damaged community or create a community in a previously uninhabited area. So essentially, if you don't pass the tipping point, succession can recover from damage or start something new. Say you have a new island that forms, or a volcanic eruption puts out a layer of lava, a glacier scrapes away the soil, or you pave a parking lot. Well, there's no soil there, so we have what's called primary succession. It's a previously uninhabited area. What happens is organisms like bacteria and lichens and mosses come in and they break down that rock and they begin to produce soil from the rock. We call those pioneer species. You can see an example of a yellow lichen on the top right. Those pioneer species in turn die and their bodies become part of the soil positive feedback loop, increasing the complexity of a system. This process continues through a series of stages called seral stages until we reach a climax community. A climax community is one that is stable for long periods of time. If you're looking at a terrestrial system, the most common climax community would be something like a hardwood forest, something really stable, very diverse, very little change for decades to centuries to really however long until something comes in and interferes with that system. Secondary succession is the reestablishment of damaged ecosystems. So there is soil left intact, say a forest fire or a storm or something like that. Plants and other organisms that remain start the process of regrowth. It's very similar to primary succession, except you're skipping that pioneer species stage. You don't need to make soil. You already have soil. So secondary succession will occur a lot faster than primary succession. The ultimate goal is, just like in primary succession, to reach a climax community, and it's going to continue to work that way unless something interferes with it. Succession is a continual process. Some stages and the organisms that compose the communities that characterize these stages may last for a short period of time, while others may last for hundreds of years. Any disturbance to the ecosystem will affect the rate of succession in a particular area. Usually secondary succession, like we said, will occur faster, but if you have frequent disturbances, the area is going to be mostly characterized by early stages. If the disturbances are moderate, the area will go towards some later stages. And really what we see is that the process of succession occurs in all ecosystems everywhere, and you don't tend to have a region that's all just one or the other. You end up with a mix. You end up with something, a mosaic of primary and secondary and things in different stages of life. But you always are going to start off with pioneer species like the lichens and the mosses. You'll work your way up to things like grasses. All of these things will eventually die and decay, producing more and more soil. You work your way up to things like bushes and small trees, and they begin to compete with light for resources and so on. And so you start losing some of that diversity, but you get to larger organisms, and then eventually you get to the trees. And the trees are going to be shade tolerant. They're going to be very stable, hardwood climax community. End results. Overall, that's how succession works. It's not going to be all one or the other. You could be in all four stages at once, depending on what's going on in that system. But in the end, everything comes together. Biological diversity is the full range of variety and variability within and among living organisms. It's not just living things, though. It could be a wide variety of genes. It could be a wide number of species. It could be a wide number of ecosystems. Endangered species, that's going to be a problem, because if you lose species, you lose diversity. Say, for example, the pitcher plants in South Carolina, they're endangered. So they have less genetic diversity than species that are more common, and therefore not threatened. So we need to be aware that some habitats are threatened, some systems are threatened, some genes are threatened, and we need to find ways to protect all of these things, not just the species themselves. Well, why should we do that? Why should we protect biodiversity? Turns out that it's actually very good for us. Ecosystems with wide variety of species, that is to say greater biodiversity, tend to be more resilient to change than those with a few species. An ecosystem rich in biodiversity will be more stable. Changing environmental conditions can cause the decline of local biodiversity, so if you have a wide variety of things, they're more likely to adapt. The more biodiversity it is, the more resistance and resilience there will be. Humans actually get a lot of benefits from the natural systems, like cleaning of water and cleaning of air and production of food and all sorts of things. We call those benefits ecosystem services. And if we were to try to reproduce those services, it would cost an insane amount. So keeping importance of biodiversity forefront is essential to conservation efforts going forward, because without biodiversity, the human race can't function properly.